America on the rebound. I am very optimistic about America. I am not one of the prophets of doom. I believe something is happening in America that is so real and so undeniable that the 21st century will be remembered as the century in which America was reborn. Did you know there are 80 million of us born-again believers now? 80 million of us. Did you know in 10 years we'll have 100 million of us? I'm talking about born-again, Bible-believing Christians, not just nominal church member type Christians, born-again Christians. There'll be 100 million of us in 10 years. And with all that said, in these recent days, I started something many years ago that the press has dubbed the religious right, which is all right. That's to be preferred to the irreligious wrong. And we have been able in the past 25 years to stir the hearts of the people of God, to break a psychological barrier that religion and politics don't mix. There's no separation between the sacred and the secular for a believer. All is sacred. And here tonight, 1 week from D-Day, it is important that we understand as light and salt that we are to give the gospel to the world, light of the world. We're to give conscience to the culture, salt to the earth. And we're to get people saved, baptized, discipled, registered to vote, informed, and out to the polls automatically and in that order. And when we do that, we save the culture. We change a bad direction of the 20th century that for a generation almost damned this country. I believe America is on the rebound. There's a verse in 1 Samuel 17, verse 29, where young David, just a teenage lad, in a time of national crisis, said, "What have I now done?" The great giant Goliath, the Philistines were threatening the very existence of Israel. He asked this question: is there not a cause? Is there not a cause? His brothers were rebuking him. His elders were ridiculing him. He was just a shepherd boy, but God had used him. He'd handled some animals in his early days and miraculously raised up of God for this day. And every Sunday school child knows what happened with the 5 smooth stones. Is there not a cause? And I submit to you that America is in crisis. When a nation is about to expel God from the square, the public square, and 10 commandments from the schoolhouses and the courthouses, and legalize same-sex marriage, and take over the culture for a secular cause to create America into something she was not founded to be, that is crucial. Matthew 5:13 through 16, in the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord Jesus said 2 things. Ye are the salt of the earth. I'm going to talk about that tonight. We are the conscience of the culture. We're called to confront the culture. But if the salt have lost his savor, his saltness, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing. And what a picture of moderate and liberal churches and sleeping Orthodox churches. Good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. The second thing, ye are the light of the world. We've been doing pretty well at that for 20 centuries. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Salt and light. Let me tell you why I believe the 21st century will be the century of the rebirth of this great America. Most historians say the 20th century was the century of America, the American century. But it was also the Renaissance and the decline of America. Because about 1960, things began to happen in this country that were troublesome to people like you and me. We kicked God out of the schools, outlawed Bible reading and prayer. And then about 10 years later, 1973, by a 7-2 vote of the U.S. Supreme Court, legalized abortion on demand, resulting since then in 45 million legal murders in this country. And having been taught in Baptist Bible College by good men who believe the Bible, religion and politics don't mix, go out and preach the gospel, win souls, pray, and make a spiritual impact on your community, but leave politics to government, leave it to someone else. We had all accepted that without asking for book, chapter, verse, and the William Sloane Coffins and the World and National Council of Churches had pretty well co-opted the waterfront. We had lost by forfeit. We weren't showing up. And I left school, as I said earlier, believing that winning souls, baptizing new converts, discipling, mentoring believers, light of the world ministry was all I was called to be and do. Francis Schaeffer called me one day, Dr. Francis Schaeffer. Now, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, for those in my generation, he was the guru of all the evangelicals. I'd never been to L'Abri, but I had read everything Dr. Schaeffer had written in his sermons and lessons. And when he called me, it just so humbled me that this guy, listening to my television program, would say, I want to meet you, and we got together. And we weren't together very long until the meeting got a little bit negative, because he said, you know, Jerry, you're doing a great job preaching the gospel, but you're a total failure at confronting the culture. I've never heard you mention abortion. You know, in 76, he came out with how then shall we live? And he and C. Everett Koop predicted that abortion that had just been legalized in 73 would lead to infanticide and euthanasia, and that this country had entered a death mode and was in a narcissistic period and was going to self-destruct, barring prophets of God standing. He convinced me he was right, though I thought he was a little bit overstating as an alarmist the case in America. Turns out he was right. He's in heaven now, but he got me to thinking. And then when Roe v. Wade became a reality, it was in the 60s that I met Schaeffer, in the 70s, Roe v. Wade. And I began looking for something to do and talking to lots of political ideologues, conservatives, as to what can the church do. And that led me in 1979 to form the Moral Majority. Pro-life, pro-family, strong national defense. This was back during the Cold War. Strong national defense and support for the state of Israel. Those were our four tenets. And I asked Dr. D. James Kennedy, Dr. Charles Stanley, Dr. Tim LaHaye to join me on the first board of formation for Moral Majority. It was an idea whose time had come. 79 and 80, we gathered together 7 million families, 100,000 pastors, and we registered 8.5 million voters and activated millions more who were registered as evangelicals but who were not voting. Only 55% of evangelicals at that time were registered to vote, and half of them didn't. While the liberals were all very actively engaged in taking this country towards secularism. And so we began looking for somebody we could support. We came to Texas and met with John Connally, the former governor, to see if he might be a good candidate for president. 4 or 5 other places. We were looking for someone pro-life, pro-family, strong national defense, strongly committed to the state of Israel. And then we sat down with the former California governor, a fellow named Ronald Reagan. About 30 minutes, we all four looked at each other and said, that's the guy right there. That's the guy. And we got behind him and began registering voters, and we were not on the radar screen for the liberal media. They didn't know we existed. They never called us when they were doing polls, and they assumed we were dead or non-existent. And so we slipped up on them and not only elected Mr. Reagan, but unelected 12 liberal senators all in one night in November 1980, and that was 24 years ago. we were on the screen the next morning and have been on ever since. But that's how it all got started. That's how it all got started. But there was a huge psychological barrier. Good pastors who believe the Bible, when you come to them and say, can we do a voter registration campaign in your church? You know, in those days, there was no motor voter. Motor voter, which made it uniform in all 50 states virtually, and making it possible to register voters anywhere simply, didn't exist then. They made it real hard for people to register. That was the idea then. And then came motor voter, and that wasn't done for us. That was done for the other side. But they forgot that we're the only crowd in America that meets 2 or 3 times a week. And so we'd go to see the pastors to do a voter registration, and some of the greatest guys I knew, my heroes in the ministry, would say, well, I don't want to start something here. Dr. Lakin used to say, don't want to stir up a stink, and he said, if it's not something is not dead there, you can't stir it up. Well, we couldn't get past the pastors. And they were so afraid of somebody getting upset or leaving the church. And we weren't, I was born and raised a Democrat. My father was a yellow dog Democrat. Vote for the devil on the Democratic ticket, did a few times. And I remember 1944, my father, who was a very successful businessman, Tom Dewey was running against Mr. Roosevelt. He was running for his 4th term. And I remember commenting to my mother, age 11, I said, you know, this Mr. Dewey sounds like a nice man. She said, hush, if your father hears you say that, he'll beat you to death. A Republican, you can't mention that word in this house. And that was our house in Virginia, and most of the South was that way. Then I got saved, and I did not become a Republican. And I'm not a Republican today. I vote Christian. I vote for the man or the woman who's closest to what I believe the Bible teaches. And so anyway, we're looking 1 week from today. There are 80 million of us. There'll soon be 100 million of us. I think we're going to win next week. And I'm not going to say what we means, but if you've got a third of a brain, you know what I'm saying. But I think we're going to win. I think we'll win quite handily next Tuesday, barring voter fraud. That I'm very concerned about that. I really am. But I can tell you, if we play with a full deck, as we Campbell County, Virginia boys used to say, if the country plays with a full deck, we'll win, because America hasn't gone that blind yet. But I do want to say to you that it's very crucial, because the next president's going to appoint between 2 and 4 Supreme Court justices. And that's going to be 20 or 30 years of stability in whichever direction. The federal marriage amendment, which we lost 48-50 in the Senate, and we won 237 to 186, but not enough, not a 2/3 vote in the House. We're bringing it back up in January. And with Mr. Daschle unemployed by that time and some others having the fear of God in their hearts, I believe that we have a real good chance of defining the family as one man married to one woman on a permanent basis beyond the reach of any court ever in the future. I believe that, but that's coming up. And we've got to have the right leadership in the White House, in the Congress, in the state houses to make all this happen. And then we've got this terrible war on terrorism. And we can't be too sensitive about it. And we can't be tiptoeing through the tulips. And I'm so glad to tell you that 25 years later, from the day that we had the pastor standing at the door and say, well, listen, I'm for you, but just don't mention my name, and we can't do voter registration here today, it's almost universal. I can't find a pastor who is not caught up in being the salt of the earth and leading his congregation to bring America back to God. It is something that can happen, and I believe that America is on the rebound.